thank you, Shannon, for the lovely introduction and for inviting us here tonight. We're really excited to be here. And of course, I can't fail to mention that I was the director at RAP from 2016 to 2018, so it's really lovely to be back in the neighborhood and to see everyone. I most recently was in Miami-Dade County for the last 3 years and moved back up here in January, so I'm very happy to be back in the area. And yeah, really appreciate it. So with that, I will get started. Also want to say, tonight's topic, we're going to be talking about expanding the concept of historic preservation a little bit from maybe what you're used to. We're in a fabulous example of what is called an adaptive reuse. So originally it was a church, now it's an event space. Took a fantastic historic building, brought it back to life. The outdoor space is amazing. But we're going to think a little bit beyond the traditional concept of preservation, of which this is a great example. And we'll talk this evening about that. I've given a version of this presentation at the state level through the Florida Trust Conference just last week, and also done some talks around diversity and inclusion in historic preservation for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. So this is a topic that's really gaining a lot of steam in the preservation field. And so, yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of changes in historic preservation, not discounting what we've done for many years. That still plays a role and it's important. It's just kind of taking a broader lens to the work we do in this field. So as I mentioned, we'll think a little bit beyond what we've thought of as traditional preservation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of better integrating equity and inclusion into historic preservation planning, touch briefly on community engagement, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some projects that we're working on here in Jacksonville. So there's not necessarily Riverside Avondale specific content in this preservation, so I appreciate you all being here and being interested anyway. I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn generally. So beyond traditional preservation, and you can see in the background just a little bit here, this is a newspaper article that talks about fair. History survives at Burton Street Fair. The Burton Street neighborhood's a neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina. I've also done a version of this presentation there. And I really enjoy seeing what different communities are working on. And so this is just to get us thinking about, you know, when we talk about history and culture, there are so many ways to celebrate that besides just our architecture, and that's just one example. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a survey. I wish I could remember what year. I feel like it was 2019-ish. And generally, this is small print, but the gist of it is that the vast majority of survey respondents agreed that historic preservation needed some more innovation, that preservation should enable residents to live, work, and play in historic neighborhoods regardless of wealth and income, and almost 100% agreed that preservation should share the multi-layered narratives of our history. This is a really great report. If you have not seen it, also from the National Trust, it's called Preserving African American Places, and it's available on their website. It's a really great resource that talks about not just preservation, but a lot of other related things, planning, economics. I was talking to someone in the audience, can't separate economics from preservation. So again, I won't read through all my slides for you, but this is just another plug for a really great publication. It was edited through Columbia University, but it's called Preservation and Social Inclusion. It's actually available totally on their website, but you can also order the book. But it talks about, you know, yes, there's this need to add more diverse sites to things like the National Register of Historic Places or to local landmark programs, but that alone isn't enough. We have to really think about our role in how our policies have contributed to systemic inequities. So it is this larger issue that preservationists should also be part of in having these conversations. So I want to talk a little bit about local government, and definitely we can be thinking about the city of Jacksonville's framework as we're talking about this, but I'm just talking about this from a kind of bigger picture view. Typically when we're talking about historic preservation and the local government aspect of that, the majority of the role that government plays with preservation is regulatory, right? So certificates of appropriateness, issuing permits, that kind of thing. Very often, preservation is associated with local planning departments, but that might not be the case. And even if they are, sometimes, like here in Jacksonville, they're technically a separate section. Lots of times the public has no idea who the Historic Preservation Department is, because if you're not a property owner interfacing with that regulatory component, why would you be involved with them necessarily? And then that also is related to the fact that a lot of times our departments, because of limited resources or capacity or just a focus on that regulation, there's not a lot of community involvement. So, it's not necessarily anyone's fault they don't know about this, and not the government's necessarily either. So there is a lot of conversation about how to, shift government involvement, and I'm going to give you a few examples of some cities that are doing that. But just some food for thought here is, can we rely solely on things like the National Register of Historic Places to tell us what's important to a community? Could there be more of a focus on cultural heritage and intangible heritage? So that's things like, storytelling or foodways, different things that aren't necessarily architectural. Again, placing more emphasis on community outreach, looking more on local level significance versus federal level, and then just the bottom question is from regulatory to something different. And again, not discounting the role of that, it's just making it more expansive. These are just a couple of pictures. I'll talk a little bit about the neighborhood on the bottom, but this is a mural from historic Central Avenue in Tampa. Central Avenue was known as the Scrub. It was almost completely wiped out by urban renewal. And then the top picture is from St. Pete, which is 22nd Street South, which is a Florida Main Street community. So I mentioned I'd give you a few examples. I highly recommend checking out the City of San Antonio's website for historic preservation. They're probably my #1 model of innovative preservation practice. They don't have an enormous staff, so I don't know how they do everything they do, but they do the traditional programs that we are used to seeing, certificates of appropriateness, design guidelines, et cetera, but they also really have embraced this idea of preservation beyond the building. So they do a lot with cultural heritage. They employ a cultural historian on their staff who works on things like oral histories and other types of programs. They do really fun events, like they have a preservation 5K. The Scout program, I believe, is related to like preservation trades. They're one of the cities I'm really interested in. There's a movement in the preservation field to have deconstruction ordinances. So when you get approval to demolish a building, you have to selectively demolish it, and some of those materials have to be rerouted back into the construction process so that they're not going to the landfill, which I think is amazing, and I'd love to see more places do that. So check out their website. They do great work. Tacoma, Washington is another one. They do a lot with social media, YouTube, and just two things I'll highlight that's really interesting about Tacoma. Definitely highlights the importance of community partnerships. So like most local governments, and especially preservation, the staff is usually not very large. So limited capacity is definitely an issue. And the key thing about partnerships, partnering with Museum of History, with different organizations that a community might have, historical societies, et cetera, to kind of help broaden this lens of preservation is really key, and they really, really do a great job of that. For example, they have a history happy hour trivia night that they do in partnership, I believe, with their museum. And then the big one that I think is fascinating, I listened to a presentation one of their staff members did at a conference, and they specifically are very deliberate. Aside from the fact that they're called the Office of Historic Preservation, they really try not to even use the words historic preservation anymore. They've just found that over the decades, it's gotten a real stigma. People have a real perspective on what that means. And so they talk a lot about history or heritage or cultural heritage, still doing the regulatory functions within that, but they're just kind of doing a rebrand. City of San Francisco, also doing very cool stuff with cultural districts. So this is something that is outside of the concept of a local historic district, which we have here in Jacksonville. Riverside, Avondale, and Springfield are our two local historic districts. City of San Francisco is doing this thing called cultural districts. They are funded through their hotel tax. And what they do is the planning department works with communities that want to become one of these cultural districts. They are given money to create a plan for their neighborhood, and the planning department is very hands-off intentionally. It's a community-led planning process. The planning department is there to kind of help facilitate and serve as a resource. But the community decides what's important to them, and they enact that through their plan. So they have 10 communities right now, very diverse. Japantown, Calle 24, a Filipino district, transgender, leather, and LGBTQ+, African American. It goes on. And every plan is different. The two that do have design guidelines, so there are two of the communities have completed design guidelines because that architecture is important. They identified that. Are Japantown and Calle 24. Those are both online. But even within the design guidelines, they're addressing more than just architecture. They're looking at streetscape and topography. It's just a really cool concept. I think we're going to see more things like this in the preservation world moving forward. So this is a big one that comes up a lot, especially in neighborhoods that have been negatively impacted by urban renewal. And Ennis is going to talk a little bit about some local examples in a minute. But this is a question that a lot of people ask. They say, okay, well, what about you have a community that's historically or culturally important, but there isn't a lot of architecture left? And I think that's where preservation especially has to be getting more creative because the architecture simply isn't there. I will touch a little bit, I meant to mention it when I started, but the building that was on the cover of my presentation, because I do want to talk about this before I talk about when the buildings are gone. So this picture, you might look at this building and think, driving by down the street, like architecturally might not jump out at you. And this is in Miami-Dade County in the Liberty City neighborhood, and especially in Miami-Dade County. I was talking to Pamela before we started. There's a lot of concrete buildings in Miami-Dade County. Most of Miami-Dade County's buildings were built after World War II. So there's a lot of concrete block and stucco. Just driving down the street, you might not look at this building and think, wow, that seems really important. So architecturally, not super ornate. It's been changed a lot. So like if you're looking towards the right there, you can see there's no windows or doors even. Well, that used to be a storefront. There were 2 stores there, but that was blocked in a long time ago. There's been a ton of changes to the building. Not that big of a deal. But this building is one of the last active IBPOEW Elks Lodges in Miami-Dade County. It's the African American Elks Association fraternal organization. And the members of this organization came to the Office of Historic Preservation, where I worked in Miami-Dade, and said this building is extremely important to us and to the Liberty City neighborhood and the corridor that it sits on. It's one of the few remaining buildings on the corridor. There's a ton of vacant lots that have been lost since desegregation. So fortunately for us, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, I'll park this thought, the county has a very flexible ordinance, so preservation ordinance. So there is the ability to still do things in neighborhoods where a lot of things are gone, but maybe there are still buildings left, but they've been changed. So hold that thought. Okay. So the top 2 pictures are in that Central Avenue neighborhood I mentioned in Tampa that's called the Scrub. And then the bottom 2 pictures are in Overtown in Miami. Central Avenue, as I mentioned, is gone. There are just like a handful of churches left, right, from that neighborhood. There's really 2 or 3. There's almost nothing from this neighborhood that's left. But they have a really cool project that it's a big park. And within that park, they have done really interesting architectural features, such as what you see up here. It's kind of like a maze, but you walk through, and they've included on the concrete walls, you can see like the Sanborn map, the fire insurance map from the community on the right. They highlighted significant people to the neighborhood. on the picture on the left. And then throughout the park too, there are markers in the sidewalks that show the history of the neighborhood. You know, obviously, would it be nice to have the building still there and not have it been completely wiped out? Of course. That is something we have to understand happened, but these are ways to help tell that history when there's no longer a building there. And then same thing in Miami. You can see on the bottom right there, there's a piece of a building left. That was Clyde Killen's house. Clyde Killens was a really significant figure in Overtown. He owned some of the clubs. He was very well known, did a lot in the community. And through a partnership with actually a public health kind of based organization to do a walking trail, they partnered and came up with these decals on the sidewalk that are actually holding up really well, surprisingly, with the sun in Miami. But they have QR codes, they have a historic photo, and you can kind of see the history of the neighborhood through that. So there are different ways to talk about things. I don't have a picture, but building footprints, if you go to Tallahassee and you go to Smoky Hollow, is that the name? Smoky Hollow. There was a neighborhood called Smoky Hollow, mostly gone. But they've also done a park that's really interesting that has kind of, they call them spirit houses. And they're just the outlines, the frames of houses, and they talk about the neighborhoods. There's a lot of interpretation. So there's definitely things you can still do. And then this is just one specific example, again, tied to local government. This is actually in St. Louis, but this is it was a corner store here. And they were on their way to, if I'm remembering correctly, on their way to a local landmark designation. The building was damaged very badly in a storm beyond repair. And the community ended up designating it anyway. It was Miss Tilly Pearson's store there on the right. It was incredibly important to the community. And so they essentially designated a vacant lot. And they're working with the family and the community. They have put a new little building there, and they're working on how they want to honor the cultural heritage. And just here it says, you know, this is not an official approach to preservation, it's a heritage cultural practice. We want to know more about history, how it affects those in the present, not just to preserve buildings. So it's just an interesting example, and there's a really great blog post on the National Trust website about that project. So I'm gonna zip through this really quickly. Lots of words here. I have underlined the history of formal historic preservation because this is really, I have a master's degree in preservation. This timeline is kind of what they teach you in preservation school. It's what we hear about. But this history that's commonly shared leaves out the efforts of other communities who were trying to do preservation at the same time but don't get recognized. So for example, you hear a lot about the late 19th century and the women who rallied to save Mount Vernon. That's kind of like the beginning of preservation in the United States. But we don't hear stories about like the 1920s when there was a group of black women who really rallied to save the Frederick Douglass House in DC. And it was just as big of a deal, but we didn't learn that in school. And the reality, all those words over here, is that the majority of our preservation framework, and again, this is just knowing history, it's not disparaging anyone in particular, it's like many of our laws. The majority of our preservation regulatory framework was created before the Civil Rights Act, during active Jim Crow segregation, before movements for women's and LGBTQ+ rights. So that's just what we're working with. The 1966 Preservation Act is the last time we had major preservation legislation. So it's a long time ago. In terms of laws, which should ideally change and be updated. So this exactly has a correlation to this, which just what I want you to take from this is that this data is a little outdated, but as of a few years ago, only 8% of the 95,000 plus sites on the National Register of Historic Places focus on women or racial and ethnic minorities. So we have a long way to go in telling a more inclusive history and recognizing those as worthy of National Register designation. Data at state and local level varies, but when I worked at the county in Miami, we did a data audit on the state and our county preservation stats. And it's the same level, same thing at the state level and at the local level in Miami. Very few of our sites in Florida are telling the story of women or racial and ethnic minorities, and same at the local level there. So it's repeated. So we have a lot of room for improvement. This is just an example of an African American site in Florida that is on the National Register. This is the Bing Rooming House in Plant City. And so it's possible. We can do it. We just need to do more of it. Okay. Strategies to include equity, and this includes in local government programs like I've talked about. The one I want to talk about here is the preservation ordinances. So I mentioned Miami-Dade County's preservation ordinance is very flexible. So the ordinance dates back to 1981, and it hasn't changed tremendously. There have been some updates over the years, but it's 40 plus years old at this point. And what's interesting is that even back then, they recognized, and I don't know if they did it intentionally, but it worked out, they include architecture, culture, economics, politics. There's like a whole broad umbrella of reasons why you could have a local landmark designated in Miami-Dade County. Architecture is just one thing. And then the preservation ordinances usually have criteria you have to meet in order to be a local landmark. Miami's, you have to meet one. You can meet one criteria and become a local landmark, and it doesn't have to be architecture. Contrast that to a place like Jacksonville, where architecture is very much front and center, and you have to meet multiple criteria. And Jacksonville is not alone. I'm not knocking Jacksonville's is more common than Miami's. But that is another conversation happening a lot in the preservation world, is that our ordinances aren't responsive enough to deal with this issue. So that might be something we see too in the future, is these preservation ordinances getting more flexible. I will just implore everyone too to understand community history. And this is really especially for urban planners and preservation professional people. I've really been amazed in the urban planning field how when a project gets started, planners think that like it starts from today. Like the vacant lot has just always been vacant. And that's almost never the case. And so I always try to get urban planners, I preach to them about trying to understand the history of a site or a neighborhood. But we also have to understand the role that government played in creating the built environment that exists today. So that might include where a lot of buildings don't exist anymore. That was government policy. That's why. And so we need to do a better job of understanding that. This is a fabulous book called Root Shock. And it talks about it's written by a MD/public policy expert. And it talks about the mental and physical health impacts of urban renewal. And it's fascinating. And so I think we need to do a better job too of understanding how these policies that we might even be enacting today impact people. Okay, I'm gonna zip through this to get to the things here locally. But basically, community engagement, everyone should be involved. Don't limit yourselves. That's the takeaway for all those words. And then thinking about project versus engagement. So this is something that I heard recently in a training that I really loved, which is, when we think of community outreach, people go into it thinking, oh, well, we have a project. But project has like an end date. There's kind of like an implied deadline with that, and engagement is ongoing. So you're building a relationship, and there's a difference there. I was last week at the preservation conference in Florida, and there was a presentation on community engagement by a fabulous woman in West Palm named Dr. Wynn, and she talked about the importance too of informing versus partnering. So when you're thinking about community outreach, are you trying to just inform people, or are you trying to partner? And I thought that was a really good distinction too. These are just pictures of me doing various outreach in a local government capacity. So, it involves being available in the evenings, on the weekend, going to events like the Shrimp Festival and wearing a bunch of shrimp necklaces, taking community-led tours on the weekend, really wanting to learn. It's not just about showing up at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday when nobody is available. Local knowledge and expertise. Long story short, especially if you're working in a community that you're not a member of, you're not the expert. And I think that's something everyone can learn, is to listen to community members when you're working with them. And it's all about building trust. And with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I don't have a master's in preservation, so a lot of this is still new to me in the traditional world. I come from a world from across the tracks. I come from.
Oh, do we need this? Sorry, I should have asked. Are we supposed to use both?
Try it without.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, that works.
Sorry about that.
So yeah, I come from a world from across the tracks. I'm Gullah Geechee, as mentioned earlier. My great-grandfather was born in 1872, came from South Carolina. He was a root doctor and eventually migrated into Florida after the insurrection of Wilmington in 1898. So my family has traditionally been in migrant working. I just heard a story last night from my dad about someone who worked with his dad that was named Jacksonville Slim, which is very interesting. Like, I'd never heard that before. So it's amazing what the stories you hear. But with that being said, I grew up as a Floridian who had parents who graduated from all-black high school, who had grandparents and great-grandparents who lived through Jim Crow. So I had a lot of family stories that were passed down to me as a kid. And then when I went to Florida A&M and majored in architecture, Florida A&M is historically HBCU, historic black college university. You have to take black psychology. You have to take black history as a part of your curriculum. I'd always grown up in public schools. You taught black history is 2 weeks like Martin Luther King in February, and that's about it. So that was really eye-opening, and then Adrienne actually introduced me back in 2017 to the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, which I am a trustee. I guess I'm the vice president at this point, as of last week. But with that being said, having that oral knowledge and history from an African-American perspective in the Deep South, combined with more people like Adrienne and having access to the Historic Preservation Office in Tallahassee and friends at the Historic Preservation Office of the City of Jacksonville, you start to see how to merge those two together because I feel sometimes in the traditional sense, the traditional world misses what that oral history means for a lot of communities. So with that being said, Adrienne has shared a lot, and I'm going to share a few slides here how we are putting some of these practices into place. So as of January the 1st, we both left our previous jobs, our previous firms, and we merged and created a new firm, Community Planning Collaborative. And the purpose of Community Planning Collaborative is a hybrid mix between urban planning and historic preservation and cultural preservation, and actually merging that in together and working with communities that have been traditionally excluded from the planning process. In Jacksonville, La Villa would be one of them. So one of the projects we're working on right now is the La Villa Heritage Trail through the DIA and the La Villa Heritage Trail and Gateways Committee. Last year, I had an opportunity to chair that particular committee. The reason that committee was formed is because around 2018 or so, DIA ended up hiring a consultant to do,
What is DI?
Downtown Investment Authority. And you have to catch me because my planning lingo, I'll use a lot of abbreviations over the years. So
Sorry about the interruption.
no problem. So the Downtown Investment Authority, over time, the boundaries of downtown have expanded. Traditionally, the North Bank is the core of downtown. Brooklyn wasn't a part of downtown. La Villa wasn't a part of downtown. The South Bank was a completely separate city at one point. But over time, these different neighborhoods are now considered downtown. They have very different, distinct backgrounds and communities. And although La Villa on the east side of Interstate 95 has gone through urban renewal, and a lot of people today would say you're starting from a clean slate or a blank slate. In reality, Interstate 95 was built through the heart of La Villa. The downtown side has gone through a series of urban renewal projects, but the west side of I-95, which some people refer to as the rail yard district, The native residents who were still there referred to themselves as La Villa, or Uptown is what they called it. Uptown was a place in North Florida. If you were black and you wanted to go down during segregation and have a good time, the clubs stayed open all night long, the restaurants stayed open all night long. That was literally Ashley Street in La Villa. So when the DIA did this particular study, the process didn't really engage the community. It almost informed the community. There was almost a predetermined outcome of what was desired at that particular time. And eventually it caused a big blow up within the community. And the DIA decided to pivot back around and try to work with the community. So I was brought in as someone the DIA respected and also the community respected to help bridge the gap. One of the first things we had to do was literally just ball up what was done, no matter how much it cost, no matter what the qualifications was of who did it, and just start over. And really the community had to lead the process. So it goes back to kind of what Adrienne said is no matter what our backgrounds are, we aren't the experts to someone who's lived their entire life. What we deem as important cultural sites may not be important to them. So we started over. You'll see a little map there. It's kind of hard to see. But in that particular map, you'll see some different colors. Over the course of time, that community had already had some engagement where they had recognized sites that were important to them that they wanted to be a part of a civil rights trail. And you can barely see it, but what's listed in red there were those sites. So we had to go back and take the work that the community had already done and respect that and build off of that. Then there's another set of green sites. Because La Villa's had so much demolition and urban renewal, every single historic site that's left in the downtown side of La Villa within that community was deemed as important to them, and they wanted those sites not only saved, but their stories told. And then there's a number of sites below that in blue. Those were sites that were the community identified as important to them that had been demolished. So we had to prioritize, but how consensus was formed on at least getting started with this project is first, a committee of community members had to be built. So how do you build a committee when people would say there's nothing left in the area? Well, this church is still there. There's some things that weren't torn down. Just about all the churches are still there. The Masonic lodges are still there. A lot of the missions, such as Clare White Mission, or there's historic school associations, alumni, such as Historic Stanton. We had to go out and actually go to each of those organizations and make sure we had at least one representative from those organizations to participate. Because even though the houses may be gone, they are the tentacles of the connections back into the community that we don't see at City Hall. In addition, we kind of combined that with some historians from the area as well, who could also connect back to the traditional side of things. But they basically determined what the path would be, what the sites would be honored. We also had to work to change the RFP process, because some things that we never pay attention to, RFP is request for a proposal. So if it's a public job, typically you have to bid for it. If you bid for it, some people would say if you come across the tracks, that's a gatekeeping mechanism that keeps people out. And one of the big things in the black community is, with history, is preservation is also economic. So to stabilize those communities, you have to preserve that history, and that history keeps the dollars recycled within the community. So how do you create another A.L. Lewis? You have to invest in somebody to do that. And so this project was also not just a trail, it's also been how do you break apart that RFP process to allow community members who are now have small marketing businesses, maybe in graphic arts, that have ties and relationships back to the people who built this community 100 years ago, to participate in bringing back that legacy. And you may not know Walter Hood, but Walter Hood is a national known black landscape architect in Oakland, California, who has designed what is going to be Lift Every Voice in St. Park in La Villa. This particular community said, we don't necessarily want another Walter Hood to come to town. Not that we don't respect his work. We want to make sure that we can grow the next Walter Hood within Jacksonville. So this trail project is really much about that. We're just starting this off. The community's defined the sites, and now we're moving forward to the next stage with the community is actually going to basically determine the general narratives of what the history will be and what those markers will actually look like. So we're in the process of doing a best practices study where we're looking at historic African-American cultural trails from across the U.S. and through the committee, finding ways to make sure that the Jacksonville Trail, the La Villa Trail, is elevated and better than those. Next slide. Another project that we worked on over the years, this actually predates us having Community Planning Collaborative, the American Beach Cultural Heritage Master Plan. American Beach is located in Amelia Island, just south of Fernandina Beach. It was founded by A.L. Lewis, who was the first black millionaire in the state of Florida, who was the president of the African American Life Insurance Company that was based in downtown Jacksonville. So he established this beach in 1935 as a black beach resort based on rest and relaxation without humiliation. If you go on up to Amelia Island, you will notice that if you're familiar with this beach, you'll notice the Omni is on one side and the Ritz-Carlton is on the other side. Yet this little historic piece of black history is still there on the Atlantic Ocean, which is really unique. And one of the reasons it is unique is because of discrimination. It never had water or sewer. So when Adrienne was the planning director of Nassau County, she engaged on a series of community engagement and outreach activities with the community to try to bring more consensus on a vision for them to move forward and a step in the process of getting them there. One of the things that came out of that initiative and her work was the Cultural Heritage Master Plan. I had the opportunity to serve as a sub-consultant on that particular project. And one of the big things that came up with, in the beginning, you had to allow the community to vent before you could even talk about anything. The consultant team learned some lessons. I kind of knew we were going to get flamed in some of these meetings, but I had to go through the process. It was just as much as a learning lesson for the consultants as it was for the county staff at that particular time. But she was in Miami at that point. But yeah, you weren't there. But we went through a process where the consultant team wanted to do a charrette and show pretty pictures before that original meeting. And I said, please don't do this. Please don't do this. They know this community better than you. They don't trust the county for a number of reasons. You're not going to like what we're going to walk into. So we showed these pictures. We did the traditional planning thing where you have a series of pretty renderings. You give everybody red and green dots. And you say, put the dot on the color on the one you like. Green, you like it. Red, you don't. Every single rendering filled with red. And some people on the planning team got their feelings hurt, and we had to kind of walk and process that. It wasn't anything, personal. But by the end of the process, by letting that community lead that planning process, amazingly, at the end, we did have people come up and said, thank you. We never thought in the beginning that you would listen to us. And really through this cultural heritage master plan, they were speaking semantics. One group was saying couch, and one group was saying sofa, and they were just punching each other over it. End of the day, you both just want to sit down, so let's get to the sit down part, right? And when the couch and sofa conversation was around tourism, the county viewed tourism as people come to the Omni, they like to get on their bikes, want to ride around, want to drive and park on the beach, enjoy this history. And the neighborhood is like, if we see one more cyclist or one big truck with a Confederate flag rolling, parking on our beach, we're going to explode. Yet the neighborhood would also say, we don't want tourism, but I would like to have my family reunion here. I would like my grandkids to come visit and go to the beach. We would like to have historic heritage signs to honor our history. We do want to preserve this. We love, big non-outer dune. And as they're saying this, you're saying, well, this is technically a form of tourism, it's cultural tourism. So how do you bridge those two together? So this project happened to do that, but where consensus really happened is about midway through, community members said, we got to have a family meeting. And the consultant team said, what's that? And they were like, you mean all y'all got to go? Oh, Ennis, he can say, we like him, he can say. But the rest of y'all got to go. We are going to assign block captains. So it's going to be a representative for each block in this neighborhood. That representative is going to work with their 3 or 4 neighbors to bring consensus within their block on what they want to see coming out of this. And we're going to provide that back to the planning team. And then based off of that, we were able to build consensus. So, but it did take having to step back from the traditional process and let that community lead that process. Next slide. This is another project you're probably going to be hearing pretty soon. This is the East Side zoning overlay. So the east side of out east is how the neighborhood will call it, is just east of downtown Jacksonville. Dates back to 1869. Wayne, if I'm wrong, just hit me upside the head. Platted in 1869 as the neighborhood of Oakland. And then it's basically grown, and really the community considers everything from the St. Johns River to the south up to Long Branch Creek, which is near Talleyrand and Evergreen Cemetery, as out east. But we worked with them over the past year and a half to get the neighborhood designated on the National Register. And it was officially designated or listed to the National Register of Historic Places as a historic district on July 3rd of this month. Long time coming, but there were some reasons. So there are some reasons we went National Register as opposed to local district. This is a neighborhood where people were in danger of gentrification or being displaced due to downtown development, due to what's proposed at the Jaguar Stadium, due to UF probably building a campus in that area. But they want to prosper in place. They're not NIMBYs, they're YIMBYs. It's like, we want growth, we want job creation. We've been asking for jobs here for 50 years, nobody's listened. So how can we have this economic development, but it not run us over? We don't want to be what happened to Brooklyn. We don't want to be what happened to La Villa. So the difference between them and Brooklyn and La Villa is there was never policy in place to protect those residents or guide new growth to fit and job within that existing community. So yet they also want to have some flexibility in terms of economics that our local historic districts and design guidelines don't necessarily provide. So the National Register was a way to kind of step in a little bit, very honorary, but it also opens the door for nonprofits, historic nonprofits that are contributing resources to that district to have access to grants, and then revenue producing properties to have access to tax credits, which helps with the capital stack. So the Union Terminal Warehouse is a big development restoration project underway. Was the largest historic warehouse when it was built in the state of Florida back in like 1913 or 14. But that project would not be possible without the use of tax credits for that developer. But the National Register process was just a step. It was the first step. The second step here is a zoning overlay, which is what we're engaging the community with now. The zoning overlay is intended to be a culturally appropriate zoning overlay. I would argue we need to overhaul our zoning in this entire town, but the East Side can't wait for Jacksonville to figure out how to overhaul zoning over 800 square miles. So what this overlay looks at is we can guide growth. We don't necessarily have to get as detailed as having design guidelines, but we can have some leadership and vision in terms of what's the appropriate scale for infill, what is, if you're going to allow lot aggregation, which means you allow a developer to buy 7 25-foot wide lots, knock them all down and build a 8-story condo or apartment complex. If you don't allow those lot aggregation, they have 25-foot wide lots. Those 25-foot wide lots have little small shotgun houses on them. Shotgun house, I would tell you, people like to use the word tiny house. That's what a shotgun house is. And that's very important to that community. We also have an issue here in this town where we're fighting to have enough affordable housing. What's more affordable than like a 600, 700 square foot house that you can own and not rent? A shotgun house. So there's ways, with the zoning overlay, if you can guide growth and development, you can actually, as a side, support the preservation, natural preservation of some of these larger blocks of homes, but also you can always encourage growth and development in areas where a lot of urban renewal has occurred in that neighborhood. So the overlay is really about balancing infill growth in a scale that is appropriate for the neighborhood and support that unique sense, Gullah Geechee sense of place that the East Side has from a market rate perspective. So that is underway, and hopefully, I guess we should have the community engagement part wrapped up this fall, and then we'll provide the language to the city's planning department, and it may take a year or so, but hopefully we'll have another overlay here that can be an example for other communities like the East Side of Jacksonville moving forward. Is that the last one?
Yeah, just the wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, these are just some challenges and opportunities with everything that we've talked about in our presentation. I'll just pick a couple here that I think are particularly important. One is the meaningful community engagement piece. So, you know, as planners especially, we're kind of used to doing community engagement as determined by maybe a local zoning ordinance, which says you have to have 2 public hearings, check, check, we're done. Well, that's not meaningful community engagement. So it's really shifting to that idea of that partnership versus informing. And then the other one that I just want to highlight that I think is really interesting, well, 2, I'll pick 2. One is to follow up on what Ennis said about the East Side, which is a culturally appropriate zoning overlay. So something that's a real challenge, and there's not a real good answer for it yet, and we're trying to figure it out and done research nationally, no good answers, is how do we codify or regulate? So going back to that idea that preservation largely does have this regulatory function, or zoning does, but when we're talking about cultural or intangible heritage, how does that translate into law? Not quite there yet on how we do that, but we're trying to figure it out. And then lastly, the one, we ran into this issue in Miami-Dade County, is in historic preservation, the threshold for something that's historic is 50 years. Well, that's into the early 70s at this point. So, you know, when we're talking about some of these decisions that were made around urban renewal or policies, this is still pretty recent past. 50 years is not that long ago. And how are we addressing some of these and having honest conversations and meaningfully engaging with people when there's some of the people are still alive who made some of these decisions? You know, La Villa's urban renewal was in the 1990s. So those people are still around. So how are we, you know, how do we wrestle with that? So no good answers for that either. It's just something to be mindful of. But yeah, that's just kind of a summary of some of the issues facing this discussion, but also opportunities. And with that, that is the end of our presentation. I think we have time for discussion, right? Yeah, thank you.